In 2022, Microsoft, the #1 champ of the business world, pulled in an eye-popping annual profit of $135 billion US. Now, that's over 35 million more than Apple did that same year. But what if I told you that even with such an insane amount of cash, that's not even the highest amount a company has ever raked in? In that very same year, one company blew everyone's minds by cashing out a jaw-dropping $161.1 billion in profit, making history as the biggest profit ever recorded in business history. That company is none other than Saudi Arabia's very own oil empire, Saudi Aramco. And if we're being real, it's almost impossible to believe that this powerhouse started from nothing but scorching sand back in the early 20th century. Ladies and gents, this is the story of Saudi Aramco, the greatest oil company in the world. Saudi Aramco's journey began during World War I, when there were major oil shortages. At the same time, an agreement called the San Remo Petroleum Agreement of 1920 was in place, which essentially shut American companies out of the oil game in Mesopotamia, thanks to the UK and France. Meanwhile, over in the US, there was a push for an open-door policy, which was all about wanting a fair shot at the oil action. And who better to kick things off than Herbert Hoover, the Secretary of Commerce? He launched this policy in 1921, essentially saying that America wanted in on this oil party too. But before fully diving into Saudi Aramco, let's take a quick trip through the history of Saudi Arabia. I mean, technically, without the country itself, there would be no Saudi Aramco. You see, back in 1932, Saudi Arabia officially became a country when King Ibn Saud brought together 4 different regions: Hejaz, Najd, Eastern Arabia, and Southern Arabia, under one united flag. It was like the ultimate power move after decades of strategic conquests that cemented Ibn Saud's status as the kingdom's first ruler. Now, once Ibn Saud got the crown, he wasted no time realizing that his kingdom was more than just endless stretches of scorching sands. He saw the potential, especially when it came to oil. So barely a year into his reign, Saudi Arabia dipped its toes into the oil game by teaming up with the Standard Oil Company of California, aka SoCal, which later became the Chevron that we all know today. And in just a couple of years, that move set the stage for the major oil industry in the world. The concession gave SoCal the green light to start hunting for oil in Saudi Arabia. So in November 1933, they set up the California Arabian Standard Oil Company, also known as CASOC. CASOC was essentially a management company specifically for handling the concession. In 1936, after the company hit a dead end in their oil quest, the Texas company, better known as Texaco, swooped in and snagged a 50% stake in the concession. Keep in mind, at this point, they hadn't struck oil yet, and serious exploration hadn't even kicked off. In fact, folks weren't even sure if there was oil hiding in the depths of the country. Fast forward to early June 1934, and the geologists wrapped up their detailed study on a geological structure they dubbed the Dammam Dome, marking the end of their first field season in Saudi Arabia. They sent a preliminary report back home to San Francisco, recommending that drilling should start. But it wasn't until 4 long years later, in 1938, that they hit pay dirt with the 7th drill site in Dhahran, known as Dammam No. 7. And you know who we have to thank for that? None other than Max Steinecker, an American geologist. Steinecker took the reins as chief geologist for the US oil prospectors in 1936 and spent years scouring the Arabian Peninsula for any signs of potential oil reserves. It was a long, hard journey, but boy was it worth it in the end. So much so that after he passed away in 1952, folks hailed him as the man who paved the way for discovering Saudi Arabia's massive oil reserves, propelling Saudi Arabia into the spotlight as a major player on the international energy scene. It laid the foundation for the kingdom to emerge as one of the world's foremost energy hubs. The success of the Saudi oil industry was undeniable, and the significance of the Dammam Well No. 7 couldn't be overstated. In fact, when the news broke, CASOC's headquarters in San Francisco couldn't contain their excitement. According to a 1963 Aramco World article, their cable back included just one word: Congratulations. In a little over a year after the initial discovery, Saudi Arabia celebrated a major achievement, its very first shipment of oil heading overseas. The tanker, named the DG Schofield after one of the early pioneers of the SoCal Oil Company, carried about 100,000 barrels of oil. While that might seem small compared to today's massive tankers, back then it was a big deal and marked a significant moment in Saudi Arabia's journey into the world of oil production. The next big oil strike came in 1941, when they hit black gold in Abqaiq. It was a big deal, especially because it came about 5 years after Steinecker, along with his buddies J.W. Hoover and Jerry Harris, had been exploring the area. Fast forward 3 years later to 1944, and that's when the name Aramco first popped up on the scene. You see, Cassock got a makeover and was rebranded as the Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco as we know it today. In 1948, things got even more interesting when Standard Oil of New Jersey swooped in and grabbed a hefty 30% stake, while Socony Vacuum took 10%. Meanwhile, SoCal and Texaco held onto their pieces of the pie, each with 30%. It was a game changer, especially since the newcomers were also mixed up with the Iraq Petroleum Company. But they had to jump through some hoops, thanks to the Red Line Agreement. By 1949, Aramco was making waves beyond Saudi borders, poking into Abu Dhabi, which stirred up a bit of a feud over borders. But through it all, Aramco kept their eye on the prize, pumping out a staggering 500,000 barrels per day by the end of the 40s. Now, to put that number into context, Saudi Arabia's current oil production stands at over 10 million barrels per day. That is to say that over the years, they have managed to increase their capacity 20 times more. Now, that's some serious growth spurt. A growth spurt that began in 1951, when Saudi Arabia opened the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, a 1,200-kilometer lifeline across the Gulf region, making it a breeze to ship oil to the Mediterranean Sea. It was like the oil expressway, slashing the time and effort needed to load up tankers. After seeing how quickly the oil industry was booming in Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud threw down the gauntlet, threatening to nationalize the oil facilities unless Aramco agreed to split the profits right down the middle, 50-50. To sweeten the deal, the American government threw in a tax break for the US Aramco member companies, known as the Golden Gimmick, which matched the profits handed over to King Ibn Saud. With the new agreement in place, Aramco packed its bags and shifted its headquarters from New York to Dhahran. In 1951, Aramco hit the jackpot yet again with the discovery of the Safaniya oil field, the biggest offshore field on the planet. And just when you thought it couldn't get any better, in 1957 they stumbled upon a series of smaller connected oil fields, confirming the Gawa field as the largest onshore field in the world. Saudi Aramco took another giant leap towards global oil market domination in 1960 with the establishment of OPEC. This organization united the world's major oil producers, excluding the USA and Russia, forming a powerful group aimed at coordinating oil production policies. Today, OPEC is considered the most influential organization in the oil market, wielding significant control over prices. Up until this point, Aramco wasn't under the control of the Saudi state, but that all changed in 1973 when the Saudi government bought a 25% stake in the company. With the USA backing Israel, including a hefty aid package dubbed Operation Nickel Grass, tensions were high. In solidarity with other nations involved, OPEC decided to hit Western countries with higher oil prices and cut back on production. Seeing this as an opportunity, Saudi Arabia stepped in and bought a 25% stake in Aramco. They weren't stopping there, though. By 1974, they had bumped up their ownership to 60%, effectively taking control. Finally, in 1980, the government completed the process, nationalizing all of Aramco's assets. This meant that all of Aramco's oil rights, production equipment, and facilities came under government control. The final transformation came in 1988, when the Saudi Council of Ministers, effectively Saudi Arabia's cabinet, approved the establishment of the Saudi Arabian Oil Company, better known as Saudi Aramco today. As tensions flared during the Persian Gulf War in 1990, Aramco found itself in a critical position, with Iraq and Kuwait sidelined from the global oil market. The pressure was on Aramco to step up production by a whopping 4.8 million barrels per day. This was essential to keep the world's oil supply stable, while also meeting the fuel demands of the coalition forces. To meet this colossal demand, Aramco went into overdrive, bringing back life to 146 oil wells and their associated infrastructure. These assets had been sitting idle since the oil price crash of the 1980s. It was a massive effort that paid off, boosting daily production from 5.4 million barrels per day in July to a staggering 8.5 million barrels per day by December 1990. As if that wasn't enough, Aramco also began expanding its reach in the Asian market in 1990. They struck deals with countries like South Korea, the Philippines, and China, aiming to secure their position in the rapidly growing Asian economy. By 2016, a whopping 70% of Aramco's crude oil sales were directed towards Asia, showcasing its pivotal role in powering the region's development. In May 2001, Saudi Arabia shook up the energy sector with its gas initiative by teaming up with 8 international oil companies, IOCs, to explore new gas reserves. They were on a mission to uncover untapped potential in key areas like South Ghawar, North Rub al Khali, the Red Sea, Shaiba, and Kidan. 2 years later, in 2003, big players like the Royal Dutch Shell and Total Energies jumped on board, joining forces with Saudi Aramco in Core Venture 3. By 2004, Aramco was hitting impressive production numbers. They were churning out 8.6 million barrels of oil per day, inching closer to its full potential of 10 million barrels per day. To kick things up a notch, they launched a gusty 5-year plan in 2005, pumping a whopping $50 billion into expanding production to 12.5 million barrels per day. It was a bold move, involving not just boosting production and refining capacity, but also doubling the number of drilling rigs. And in that same year, Saudi Aramco didn't just dominate the energy sector, it owned it. With a jaw-dropping estimated market value of $781 billion, it was officially the biggest company in the world. In June 2008, when crude oil prices soared past $130 a barrel, Aramco sprang into action and cranked up production to a hefty 9.7 million barrels per day. By the following year, in 2009, they had upped their game even further, reaching a staggering production capacity of 12 million barrels per day. But as competition heated up and oil prices took a nosedive, Aramco had to make some tough calls. The plummeting prices forced them to scale back production to 7.7 million barrels of crude oil per day. In 2011, Saudi Aramco hit a major milestone when it started pumping natural gas from the Karan gas field, churning out a significant 400 million standard cubic feet daily. But the party didn't last long. By 2014, the oil market took a sharp downturn, witnessing prices plummet by a staggering 50% in a short span. This sudden plunge put a strain on Saudi Arabia's economy, exposing a stark deficit as government revenues struggled to match expenses. In response, Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman took the reins, leading the charge on Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 plan. This bold initiative aimed to modernize and diversify the economy by tapping into untapped mineral reserves, strengthening global trade ties, and tapping into the potential of religious tourism. As part of this transformative vision, listing Aramco in international financial markets emerged as a strategic move. In January 2016, Prince Mohammed bin Salman shook things up even further by exploring the idea of listing shares of the state-owned company. With plans to sell off about 5% of these shares, the goal was to establish a robust sovereign wealth fund capable of weathering economic storms and ensuring long-term stability. And in a way, you could say it worked out pretty well, because by September 2018, the Wall Street Journal was buzzing with news that Aramco had its sights set on a $1 billion venture capital fund to dive headfirst into the international tech scene, marking a daring leap into the future. That same year, Saudi Arabia mulled over putting up to 5% of Saudi Aramco's ownership on public trading through a staged initial public offering, IPO. While the move was vetted by major banks, concerns over Aramco's corporate structure lingered. lingered, delaying the IPO into 2019. Later that year, drone attacks on Aramco's facilities added further complications. On April 9, 2019, Aramco made waves by issuing bonds collectively valued at a whopping $12 billion. Its first international bond issue received an overwhelming response, with orders from foreign investors surpassing $100 billion, smashing records for a bond issue by an emerging market entity. In 2020, Saudi Aramco, like many companies, felt the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, seeing a drop in net income from $88 billion to $49 billion compared to the previous year. Despite this, they remained a powerhouse, boasting reserves totaling 255.2 billion barrels. Interestingly, Aramco outshone competitors such as Royal Dutch Shell and even Apple in profitability. The company even acquired a 70% stake in Saudi Basic Industries Corporation for $69.1 billion that same year. In just a few short years, Saudi Aramco's success story has been nothing short of spectacular. By the end of 2022, they were reporting a jaw-dropping $161 billion in annual profit, setting a new benchmark in the oil and gas industry. Even in 2023, they maintained their strong performance, raking in $121 billion in profit. Their incredible profitability was fueled by a whopping $592 billion in sales from oil and petrochemicals, a massive leap from the previous year's $400 billion. In August, Fortune magazine hailed Saudi Aramco as the most profitable company ever, showcasing its remarkable achievement. So there you have it. With a current market value of over $2 trillion, Saudi Aramco isn't just a giant in the oil business, it's one of the biggest companies on the planet.